Hello, I'm really glad you're here tonight. This hour is different from the rest of the day. It doesn't ask you to decide anything. It doesn't ask you to perform or explain or keep up. It simply invites you to lie still and let your thoughts move at their own pace. As the years pass, nighttime becomes a kind of companion, a place where the mind is free to wander without interruption, where memories return, not urgently, but patiently, where understanding settles in quietly, without needing words. Later in life, the mind doesn't race the way it once did. It reflects, it revisits, it connects dots that once seemed unrelated. And it does this most honestly when the lights are off and the world has gone silent. This space is for those thoughts, the ones that don't surface during the day, the ones that arrive only when you're alone with yourself, resting, remembering, and gently making sense of a long lived-in life. So take a slow breath. Let your body soften into the bed and allow this night to meet you where you are. And now, before we begin, if this kind of honest, gentle reflection speaks to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And down in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. There's something comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, but united in these late hours when the world finally grows still. So settle in, adjust your pillows, find a comfortable position, and know that for the next hour you're not alone in whatever wisdom you're carrying, whatever understanding you've earned, whatever truths rise to the surface when the lights go out. Let's begin. You are lying still now. The weight of the day is leaving your body slowly, the way water recedes from dark riverbank sand at low tide, quietly, without announcement, drawing back into something larger and older than itself. And as the room grows quieter around you, as your breathing finds its own unhurried rhythm, something inside you shifts. A door opens somewhere deep in your imagination. Not forward into plans or worries or the things that need doing tomorrow, but backward, far backward, across centuries and oceans and the thick, humid distance of time itself. You're going somewhere tonight that most people have never been. You're going to the edge of a world that no longer exists in any form you can touch or photograph or verify. But it was real. It was extraordinarily, magnificently real. And some part of you, some ancient part that remembers more than your waking mind allows, recognizes it the moment it begins to take shape in the darkness behind your closed eyes. You're standing on the bank of the Musi River, on the island of Sumatra, in the kingdom the ancient Sanskrit inscriptions called Srivijaya. The year does not matter precisely. Somewhere in the long golden corridor between the 7th and 13th centuries, when this harbour was the most consequential crossroads on the surface of the earth. When every ship sailing between India and China, between the Persian Gulf and the South China Sea, had to pass through the narrow throat of the Malacca Strait just beyond the river's mouth. And whoever sat at the edge of that strait, whoever understood its currents and its winds and its hidden shallows, held the whole world's commerce in their hands. Srivijaya understood this before anyone else did, and so Srivijaya became something the world had never quite seen before. Not merely a kingdom, not merely a port, but a living, breathing intersection of civilizations, a place where Sanskrit and Malay and Tamil and Arabic and the dialects of the Chinese coast were spoken on the same dock, sometimes in the same breath, sometimes in the same sentence. A place where the spices of the Eastern Islands met the manuscripts of the Indian monasteries and the silk of the Chinese workshops and the glass beads of the Persian ateliers, all within walking distance of the same muddy riverbank. You breathe that in now, let it settle. The sky above you is the deep violet of pre-dawn, not black, not grey. Violet, the specific colour that the tropics hold in the final hour before first light, a colour that exists nowhere else in quite this way. The Musi River lies before you, wide and slow-moving and dark, its surface carrying the fractured reflections of oil lamps burning on the wooden piers below. The air sits on your skin like warm cloth. It always does here. Tropical air is not the thin, dry air of high places. It is full. It has substance. It carries moisture from the jungle, pressing close against the city's landward edge, and salt from the strait waiting beyond the river's mouth. And layered into both of these is something else, something that stops you every morning no matter how many mornings you have spent here. The smell of commerce, the smell of every civilization on Earth in the same place at the same time. You have been here before, not in this lifetime, but somewhere in the long memory that the body carries without the mind's permission. You know this harbour the way you know certain pieces of music that make you ache for a home you cannot locate. You recognise the rhythm of it, the way the rowers call across the dark water before the sun has risen, the way the great wooden hulls groan and creak against their mooring ropes as the river current shifts beneath them, the way the harbour wakes not all at once but in layers, the way a symphony builds from a single note in a single instrument into something immense and full and alive. Let your body sink a little deeper now. The bed is holding you completely. The first sounds are always water, the soft irregular slap of the river against painted wood, the deeper sound of the current moving beneath the surface, that low constant hum you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. Water is everything here. This kingdom exists because of water, because of the understanding that the Malacca Strait is not simply a body of ocean between two land masses, but the most valuable corridor on Earth, and that to sit at its entrance with enough boats and enough knowledge and enough diplomacy is to hold a position of power that no army alone could ever defend or maintain. You walk along the pier in the pre-dawn darkness, and you can feel the damp planking beneath your feet, worn smooth by decades of sandaled soles and bare feet, and the sliding weight of loaded cargo sacks. The pier stretches in both directions, and along its length the ships are moored in a pattern that has its own logic, its own geography. To your left, toward the river's western bank, the Indian vessels from the Coromandel coast ride high in the water, their holds emptied yesterday, now waiting to be reloaded. Their hulls are stitched together with coconut fibre rope rather than iron nails, a technique that seems fragile to those who have never sailed on them and seems perfectly reasonable to those who have. The fibre stitching flexes with the sea rather than fighting it. It bends without breaking. There is a philosophy in this construction that goes beyond engineering, though the builders may never have thought of it in those terms. Beyond the Indian vessels, the Arab dhow sit lower, their triangular lateen sails furled loosely against their masts, their holds carrying glazed Persian ceramics and lengths of fine cotton cloth and small leather pouches of silver coin that the Srivijayan treasury will weigh and record by morning. Further along still, the Chinese junks rise enormous and red-painted against the lightening sky, their multiple masts bare, their crews still sleeping on deck under cotton awnings, their holds carrying the porcelain and silk and copper cash that flow from the workshops of the Tang and Song dynasties, across the South China Sea in a current as regular and as reliable as the monsoon winds themselves. And woven among all of these foreign vessels, the local ships, the Malay outrigger craft, the Jong with their extraordinary crab-claw sails furled for now but ready. These vessels are the harbour's own heartbeat. They know every current of the strait. They know every seasonal shift of the monsoon winds, the northeast monsoon that blows from November to March, and the southwest monsoon that reverses everything from May to September. The pilots who sail them have been sailing these waters since childhood, taught by fathers who were taught by their own fathers. The knowledge passed down not in books but in the body, in the hands on the tiller, in the eyes reading the colour and texture of the water's surface, in the particular quality of attention that comes only from decades of paying close notice to the same stretch of sea in every kind of weather. The sky's paling now, rose at the horizon over the river's far bank. Let your breathing slow with it. You're a scholar. You arrived here months ago on an Indian merchant vessel, seasick and astonished, carrying a letter of introduction from a Buddhist teacher in Bengal who had himself studied here 30 years prior. You came because of what you had heard, that Srivijaya had built something the world had never assembled in quite this form. Not just a harbour, not just a market, but a place of learning so unusual in its breadth and its openness that scholars travelled weeks across dangerous open ocean simply to sit in its halls. That the king himself, the Maharaja, had sent ships to bring learned men from the Nalanda monastery in northern India, from the Tamil kingdoms of the south, from the Buddhist communities of Sri Lanka and Java, and the Malay Peninsula. That the learning halls of Srivijaya held Sanskrit manuscripts and Pali commentaries and mathematical treatises and astronomical texts and navigational charts and medical knowledge from half a dozen civilizations. and that these materials were not locked away in temple archives, but were actively taught, actively discussed, actively contested and refined by living human minds every morning before the harbour had fully woken. You found this to be true. Everything you had heard was true and more. The learning halls are built on the hillside above the harbour, set among trees that have been trimmed to allow ocean breezes through their upper branches. They are not grand structures by any architectural standard. They are long, open-sided pavilions with steeply pitched palm leaf roofs and raised hardwood floors and benches worn smooth by generations of seated scholars. They have no walls on three sides. The air moves through them freely. The sounds of the harbour drift up the hill and settle into the silences between spoken phrases. Sometimes a teacher will pause mid-sentence and both teacher and students will simply listen to the harbour for a moment, as if the harbour itself is contributing to the lesson. Your teacher here came from Nalanda. He left that great monastery as a young man on a merchant vessel heading south and east, intending to study in Srivijaya for a single season. He is still here. He has been here for 37 years. He tells you this without regret, without the weight of a man who got lost. He tells you the way a man describes the colour of the river he was born beside, as a fact about the shape of things. Every morning the learning hall fills before the sun is properly above the horizon. You arrive in the blue, half-dark, and take your place on the worn bench and settle into the posture of attention that your body has slowly been learning over these months. The teacher does not begin with drama. He begins the way the harbour begins, from silence, from a single point of stillness. He will say one word, often a Sanskrit word, a term that carries within it a universe of meaning the way a seed carries within it a universe of growth. He will say it once. He will let it sit in the humid morning air. He will say it again. And then, with the same unhurried care that the cargo handlers use unwrapping the most delicate trade goods on the dock below, he will begin to open it. This morning he spoke about interconnection, about pratyasamutpada, the Buddhist teaching of dependent origination, the idea that nothing in the world exists independently, that everything that exists does so because of every other thing that exists, that the lamp burns because there is oil and wick and air and the hand that lit it, and the tree that produced the oil and the rain that fed the tree. That you sit here because of the teacher, and the teacher sits here because of Nalanda, and Nalanda exists because of centuries of patronage, and those centuries of patronage exist because traders needed safe passage through mountain routes, and those routes exist because rivers carved them through rock over millions of years. Everything touching everything, everything caused by everything else, nothing standing alone. You let this settle into you now the way rain settles into dry soil. Because as the teacher spoke, you found your attention moving down the hill to the harbour below, and you understood the teaching not as an abstraction, but as a physical, visible, audible fact. You understood that you were sitting inside the most perfect demonstration of dependent origination that human civilization had yet produced. The spice from the interior jungles of Sumatra existed because the soil of Sumatra was volcanic, and the rains fell with impossible regularity, and the farmers had learned over generations which plants thrived in which soil and at which altitude. That spice reached this harbour because the farmers sold it to the river traders, and the river traders poled it down the Musi to the coast, and the harbour masters recorded it, and the warehouse keepers stored it, and the pilots guided the merchant ships safely through the shallows to collect it. And those merchant ships existed because the kings of India and China desired what Sumatra grew, and because the metal workers of Persia made the goods that Sumatra's kings desired in return, and because the monsoon winds blew at the right time in the right direction to make the voyage possible without requiring more courage than ordinary men possess. All of it connected, every thread touching every other thread, the spice and the rain and the Sanskrit and the tide and the pilot's hands on the tiller and the warehouse keeper's memory and your teacher's voice and your own presence here on this carved wooden bench breathing this extraordinary thick tropical air. This is what Srivijaya understood that made it unlike any other place on earth at that time. It understood that knowledge and commerce were not separate things, that the man who could navigate the strait and the man who could recite the Mahabharata were both engaged in the same fundamental activity, the activity of paying deep, sustained, disciplined attention to the world as it actually is, of building systems that allow what is understood to be preserved and passed on, of creating a place where the world can gather and find it is understood. Let that thought drift through you now like current through the dark river. The afternoon rains come every day here without negotiation. They are not the tentative rains of temperate climates that arrive apologetically with low cloud and damp suggestion. They build visibly, and they arrive with complete authority. You have learned to read the sky the way the harbour pilots read the water. First, the high white clouds thicken and lose their clean definition. Then the middle sky turns the flat grey of old pewter. Then the horizon over the strait disappears behind a curtain of falling water that moves toward you at the pace of a walking man, steady and inevitable, consuming everything between there and here. And then it arrives. The sound on the tiled rooftops of the merchant houses is immense. It drowns everything. The harbour voices, the creaking ropes, the distant call of the river birds, all of it erased. There is only rain, sheets of it falling straight down the way things fall when there is nothing to resist. The lanes flood to ankle depth in minutes. The mud between the paving stones turns to the colour of river water. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stops. Not gradually. It stops. The sky closes. The jungle exhales. The mud begins to drain. And the air that follows the rain is the cleanest air you have ever breathed anywhere in your life. It smells of wet stone and crushed leaves and the rich dark biology of the jungle floor. And underneath all of these, the salt of the strait, sharpened by rain, carried inland on the cooling air. You stood in a doorway the first time this happened, pressed against the carved teak frame of a merchant's house, watching the lane become a river. The people around you continued their activities without comment. A woman carrying a basket of dried fish placed it under the nearest eave and stood calmly, arms folded, watching the rain with an expression of complete equanimity. A harbour official continued his walk through the flood as if the water at his shins was simply a texture the day had chosen. A young boy ran through the lanes with his arms spread wide, his face turned up, drinking the rain. You watched all of this and you understood something that your years of studying texts had not yet given you. That wisdom is not the absence of weather. It is knowing how to stand inside it without resistance. That the woman under the eave and the official in the flood and the boy with his face turned up were each expressing the same understanding in a different key. That the rain comes, that the rain ends, that the air after rain is worth waiting for. Let yourself rest in that now. The air after rain, the clean, warm, green-smelling air of a Srivijayan evening settling over the harbour after the day's final storm. The ships rocking gently, the lamps being lit one by one along the pier, the smell of rice cooking in the houses on the upper lanes, the sound of the river, always the river, carrying everything toward the sea. You're safe here. You're held here, on the warm edge of a world that was briefly, brilliantly, the centre of everything. Let your body be heavy. Let your thoughts be slow. Let the harbour keep its watch around you while you rest. The pilots know these waters. The teachers know these texts. The warehouse keepers know every jar and sack and bundle in their care. You do not need to know anything tonight. You only need to breathe and let the river carry you. The first section ends here, and the harbour breathes on. The harbour does not sleep the way you sleep. It moves through the night in a different kind of rest, a state of reduced activity rather than true stillness, the way a river continues flowing even when the boats upon it are moored and quiet. You understand this now after months of watching. The harbour has its own circadian rhythm, its own pattern of waking and deepening and waking again, and you have learned to feel that pattern in your body the way you have learned to feel the approaching rains in the quality of afternoon light. It is full dark now. The oil lamps on the piers have been burning for hours, their reflections stretched long and wavering on the slow surface of the Musi. The cargo operations that filled the afternoon with their organised noise have finished for today. The counting houses along the upper pier have closed their shuttered windows. The harbour masters have made their final rounds, their footsteps fading up the lane toward the residential quarter. The great foreign ships sit silent at their moorings, and from several of them you can hear voices, the low conversation of night watchers, the occasional sound of a pipe being played softly somewhere on a Chinese junk, a melody you do not recognize in a scale unlike any you learned in Bengal, drifting across the water and dissolving into the darkness. Let your eyes stay closed. Let the sounds of the night harbour surround you. You're not ready for sleep yet, and that is fine. The night allows this. The night of Srivijaya is generous with its hours. You have walked down from the learning hall after the evening session, which always ends later than the teacher intends because someone always asks one more question, one more thread that needs following, one more door that opens just as everyone is rising from their benches. Tonight it was a young monk from Java who asked your teacher about the relationship between the Sanskrit concept of dharma and the harbour's function as a place of dharmic exchange, where the commercial exchange, done justly, constituted a form of right action. Whether the harbour master who resolved disputes fairly was, in the deepest sense, practicing the dharma as precisely as any monk in any monastery. Your teacher sat back down when this question was asked. He always sits back down for the questions that matter. He was quiet for a long moment, and the evening insects filled the silence with their sound, and somewhere below on the river a night heron called once, its voice carrying up the hill with the cleanness of something being stated without qualification. Then he said that the boundary between the sacred and the practical was itself a kind of illusion, that the monks who had built Nalanda understood this, that the kings who had built Srivijaya understood this, that the harbour master who weighed the pepper honestly and the monk who recited the Pali canon with precision were both serving the same underlying reality, the reality of truth told accurately, of things being what they are and nothing more. You're still holding that thought as you walk along the pier now in the lamplit dark, things being what they are and nothing more. Let your breath be slow, let your body be heavy. The spice warehouses are locked at this hour, but you know their contents with a familiarity that has grown on you gradually, the way familiarity always grows, through repetition rather than effort. You've been permitted to enter them in the daylight hours many times, accompanied by the keeper you came to know first, the old man who carries his inventory in his mind rather than on tablets. His name, in his language, means something to do with the sea, which is fitting. He belongs to this harbour the way the river belongs to its banks. You think about his warehouse now as you walk. You think about the benzoin resin stored in blocks along the north wall, that golden brown aromatic solid derived from the styrax trees of the Sumatran highlands, used in incense across the entirety of the Buddhist and Hindu and Islamic worlds simultaneously, each tradition burning it toward a different heaven in the same shared sky. The resin arrives from the interior in raw chunks carried by inland traders who have travelled days through jungle on paths with no official names, but known to every family in the highlands. It is sorted here by quality, wrapped, recorded, and stored until the right buyer arrives from the right ship. You think about the camphor, stored furthest from the door because its white powder coats whatever it touches, and because it is extraordinarily valuable, and because its sharp medicinal smell is difficult to remove from cloth. The camphor of Sumatra was known across the ancient world as the finest variety available. Sanskrit texts from centuries before your own birth mention it. Arabic geographical writings describe it as the perfume of paradise. Chinese merchants speak of it with the reverence most people reserve for sacred objects. And here, in this warehouse by the Musi River, it sits in sealed wooden boxes stacked carefully on shelves of the same hardwood as the floor, waiting. You think about the cloves, which do not originate in Sumatra but arrive here from the Maluku Islands, those small volcanic specks scattered far to the east through seas, whose navigation requires different knowledge than the strait requires. The cloves travel weeks before reaching this harbour. They change hands perhaps 3 times. They come from trees that grow nowhere else in the variety that produces the finest grade, trees tended by families who have tended the same trees for generations. By the time the cloves arrive here, they already carry within them the entire chain of human effort and ecological specificity and seasonal timing that produced them, though none of this is visible to the buyer who opens the sack and breathes in that extraordinary dark, spiced warmth. Breathe that in now. Let the imagined warmth of cloves in a Srivijayan warehouse settle through your chest. There is something you have understood about the spice trade that no text prepared you for. You had expected from your reading that it was primarily about economics, about supply and demand, about the fact that pepper-preserved meat and cloves mask the smell of things stored too long. These things are true, but they are not the whole truth. The whole truth is that the spice trade is about desire of a much deeper kind, the human need to experience what is far away, what is rare, what requires effort and distance and transformation to obtain. The clove that arrived in a kitchen in Baghdad or the courts of the Song dynasty arrived carrying, invisibly, all that ocean, all those hands. You were eating Sumatra. You were eating the volcanic soil and the particular rain and the family that climbed that tree. Distance made edible. The world made small enough to hold on a tongue. Your teacher would say this was another expression of Pratya Samutpada. You're beginning to think he is right about most things. The night deepens. Let it deepen in you as well. You have turned away from the pier and you are climbing the lane that leads back toward the Scholars' Quarter, That collection of modest houses and open pavilions on the hillside where people like you live and study and argue and sometimes fall into friendships that cross every boundary of language and origin. You pass the house of a Tamil scholar who specializes in astronomical texts. His lamp is still burning, its light visible through the narrow gap of his shutter. You have spent evenings with him in which he spread his astronomical charts across the low table between you and traced with one ink-stained finger the paths of stars that the Indian tradition and the Chinese tradition name differently but describe identically. The same lights in the same sky given different names by different people who are both paying equally precise attention. This struck you as important in a way you are still working out. That the same reality receives different names from different traditions. That the star the Tamil astronomer calls by one Sanskrit name and the Chinese navigator calls by a Han Dynasty character is the same star. That the pilot who uses it to navigate the South China Sea and the priest who uses its position to calculate auspicious dates for a ceremony are both using the same fact. That reality is one thing, and the languages we use to describe it are many. That wisdom, wherever it arises, is pointing at the same world. This is perhaps what Srivijaya built. Not just a harbour and not just a library, a place where different descriptions of the same world could meet each other and recognize themselves as kin. Let that recognition settle through you now. Let it be warm. The night rain begins quietly tonight, which is unusual. The night rains of Sumatra are typically as sudden and complete as the afternoon rains, but occasionally a softer variation arrives, a rain that begins as a sound in the leaves before it is a wetness on the skin, that builds gradually and then falls in steady curtains rather than the full, vertical sheets of the afternoon storms. This is that kind of rain. You hear it before you feel it. The leaves in the trees above the lane speak first, a rising sound like many small conversations beginning simultaneously, and then the rain reaches you. Gentle, warm. Not the coolness that rain carries in other climates, but warm the way that everything here is warm, arriving against your face and hands and the top of your head, as if the sky itself is offering something rather than releasing it. You stop walking. You stand in the lane in the warm rain of a Srivijaya night, and you tilt your face upward the way the boy on the pier tilted his face up in the afternoon storm, and you let the rain fall on you, and you do not think about anything for a moment. You do not think about Sanskrit or dharma, or the clove trade or dependent origination, or the navigation of the Malacca Strait, or the difference between Indian and Chinese names for the same star. You're simply a body in warm rain in the darkness, and the rain does not ask anything of you, and the darkness does not ask anything of you, and the whole enormous harbour sleeping below you does not ask anything of you. And this is perhaps the most complete rest your mind has found since arriving in this place that offers so much to think about. Let your body find that now, that complete rest, that silence inside the sound. The rain passes. You continue up the lane and enter the scholars' quarter and find the open pavilion, where several of your fellow students sometimes sit in the evenings. But tonight it is empty, and you sit alone and listen to the water dripping from the eaves and look down through the trees at the lamps along the pier far below. There is a version of this harbour that you will carry for the rest of your life, not the version in any text or official account, your version, the private one, built from small specific moments that no one else noticed because they were ordinary to everyone who lived here, and remarkable only to you because you arrived from somewhere else and carried the capacity for astonishment that familiarity always erodes. The harbour master who sat through an entire afternoon in the rain with an Arab trader and a Chinese merchant, speaking to each in their own language, finding a solution that both considered fair, without drama, without invoking authority, without anyone being made to lose face. You watched from a distance and understood nothing of what was said, and yet by evening you had watched two men with rigid shoulders and hard eyes become two men sharing palm wine under the same canopy. The harbour master walked home with the unhurried step of a man who had done a fair day's work. The grandmother who sold rice cakes near the entrance to the warehouse district every morning, whose cart was the first thing you passed coming down from the scholars' quarter and the last thing you passed going back up, who had learned over the months of your daily passage to add a little extra palm sugar to the cake she handed you, knowing without being told that you had a weakness for sweetness in the morning, who charged you exactly what she charged everyone else and gave you a look when you tried once to offer more, a look that required no translation whatsoever. The young sailor, not older than 15, on one of the Indian vessels who spent every afternoon his ship was in harbour, at the end of the pier repairing a tear in sailcloth with a bone needle and waxed thread, singing quietly to himself as he worked. Who looked up one afternoon when you stopped to watch and sang you a phrase from wherever he came from, and waited, wanting the connection that music makes across every other barrier? And you told him in your handful of Malay that it was beautiful, and he ducked his head with a pleasure that was entirely and purely human, entirely the same in every language. This harbour is full of these moments, always has been, full of the ordinary human dignity of people doing their work with care. The warehouse keeper with his memory, the pilot with his reading of water, the harbour master with his patient diplomacy, the grandmother with her palm sugar, the boy with his song, all of them practicing in their own way the same discipline your teacher practices in the learning hall every morning. The discipline of full attention to what is actually here. Let your body release now. Let every muscle let go. The pilots of the Malacca Strait know something about navigation that no text fully captures, though many texts have tried. They know that the strait is a living system, and living systems change. The sandbanks that were here last season have shifted. The depth at the narrowest channel varies with the tide. The current on the surface runs differently from the current below it. An experienced pilot can feel 3 different winds on his skin simultaneously, and know from their combination exactly where he is and what the water ahead will do. You asked one of these pilots once how he learned all of this, where he kept it. He was a man of perhaps 45, slight and dark, with the particular quality of stillness you have noticed in the most accomplished people in this harbour. He thought about your question for a long time. Then he said, in the working Malay that has become your second language here, I do not hold it anywhere. It holds me. You've been thinking about this ever since. The idea that knowledge at a certain depth stops being something the practitioner holds and becomes something the practitioner is held by. That the pilot does not carry the knowledge of the strait the way a merchant carries cargo. The knowledge has entered him more completely than that. It has become the structure through which he perceives. Your teacher would call this prajna, the wisdom that is not an accumulation of information, but a transformation of perception. The harbour pilot and the Buddhist philosopher arriving at the same understanding from completely different directions, using completely different vocabulary, pointing with equal precision at the same extraordinary fact. The lamp goes out. The darkness settles. Let the light in your mind soften with it. The river is still moving below you in the darkness, carrying its load of silt toward the sea. It has been carrying things toward the sea for longer than any civilization here has existed. It will carry things toward the sea long after Srivijaya is only a name in stone inscriptions that future scholars will puzzle over. The river does not require the harbour to exist. The harbour required the river. This is the truth of things. The natural world lends itself temporarily to human purposes and then continues as it was. But that does not diminish what was built here. Everything that is made temporarily. Every harbour is a temporary harbour, every learning hall is temporary, every lamp flame is temporary, every human life is temporary. And yet the lamp burns, and yet the hall fills every morning with scholars who mean to understand something before their temporary time is over. And yet the pilot guides the ship with full care and full attention, not because the strait will last forever, but because the ship is here now, and the people in the hold trusting him are here now. The present moment is always the only moment. The harbour taught you this more completely than any text. You walk to your sleeping room and lie down on the sleeping mat, woven palm fibre over a low hardwood platform, and you pull the thin cotton sheet over yourself, and the sounds of the harbour come to you through the open window, softened by distance, softened by the night. The river and the rain-wet jungle and the distant creak of a mooring rope, and somewhere out on the water, the single note of the Chinese pipe, haunting and unhurried, dissolving into the air the way everything here eventually dissolves into the air. Your body is heavy now, completely, beautifully heavy. The mat holds you and the cotton sheet covers you, and the warm night air moves across your face. The sounds are softening further. The river is a sound you're inside rather than hearing. The jungle is breathing. The harbour is breathing. The whole immense living system of this extraordinary place is breathing in its slow nocturnal rhythm, and you are breathing with it. Your chest rising and falling in time with something larger than yourself, something that was here before you and will be here after you, and is entirely indifferent to your scholarship and your questions and your carefully constructed understanding And that indifference is not cold. It is simply vast, simply real, simply what is. Let yourself be carried now. You have been held by this harbour for the length of these hours we have travelled through it together. You have breathed its air and walked its pier and stood in its rain and sat in its learning hall and inhaled the aromatic darkness of its warehouses and watched its pilots read the water and listened to your teacher open Sanskrit words like the careful unwrapping of irreplaceable things. You have understood, here, in this extraordinary place, what it means for a civilization to make a space where the whole world can come and find itself received. You carry this now, not as information, not as knowledge in the accumulating sense, as something given to you by a harbour that no longer exists, and a civilization that dissolved centuries before your birth, and a river that continues regardless, and a rain that falls every afternoon without being asked. You carry it the way the pilot carries the knowledge of the strait, not in the mind precisely, in the body, in the structure through which you now perceive. You are enough. You have always been enough. The scholar who arrived seasick and astonished was enough. The scholar who stood in the doorway in the first afternoon rain was enough. The scholar who held the sandalwood and understood something without words was enough. The scholar who stood in the night rain with face upturned was enough. And you, now, in this bed, in this body, in this particular night among all the nights you have been given, you are enough. The Musi River is moving toward the sea, as it always has, as it always will, long after every name for it has been forgotten. The Malacca Strait is breathing with its tides. The monsoon is turning somewhere over the Indian Ocean, preparing its seasonal shift. The spices are waiting in the dark warehouses. The Sanskrit texts are sealed in their lacquered cases. The pilot is sleeping with the knowledge of the water held safely inside him. The teacher is sleeping with 37 years of wisdom moving gently through his dreams. And you are here, breathing, held, covered, home. The fires die down, the stories settle, and the world grows still. Let your thoughts drift away like embers on the wind. Good night. You've journeyed far through time tonight. Now it's time to journey into dreams. Close your eyes, breathe, and let sleep find you.